The people we interviewed, his old comrades from the 1970s and 1980s, were absolutely adamant that there isn't a racist bone in his body. And as the Zondo reports are starting to emerge, we can see the motive behind the accusations of calling him a racist have started to show that it is spurious.
One of the bodyguards came into the room and said, "Listen, Eugene Terreblanche is next door." So Rolf goes out and pops his head in there and says, "Hi, Eugene." And Eugene says, "Hi," back. And he says, "So now what?" And Terreblanche says, "I don't know."
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're going to chat with Jonathan Ancer and Chris Whitfield. They are both journalists and the author of Joining the Dots, an unauthorized biography of Pravin Gordhan, which will be the subject of today's discussion. So, Jonathan, let's start with you. A lot of people like Tom Moweni and advocate Dali Mpofu like to classify Pravin Gordhan as a racist, or they heavily infer that he's a racist. In light of his history, is that a valid argument to make?
I say it's a spurious allegation that's meant to distract people. When Pravin Gordhan arrived at university, he became politically aware and he devoted his life to the struggle for freedom. It wasn't just talk. He got his hands dirty. And after university, he worked to mobilize the community and was one of the pioneers of this concept of mass mobilization. He worked in legal organizations, in quasi-legal organizations, and in the underground, and was a member of the ANC. He played a crucial role in the formation of the United Democratic Front and was involved in the ANC's Operation Vula. During his activism, he was detained frequently by the security police and tortured, but the security police could never break him. So he has all those political credentials, and he was, and he still is, devoted to the principles of the Freedom Charter, which has non-racialism at its core. The people we interviewed, his old comrades from the 1970s and 1980s, were absolutely adamant that there isn't a racist bone in his body. And as the Zondo reports are starting to emerge, we can see the motive behind the accusations of calling him a racist have started to show that it is spurious. I mean, we asked Gordhan what he felt about being called a racist, because it's not only by Moyani and Pofu, but also by people like the EFF and specifically Julius Malema and Floyd Shivambu. And Gordhan shrugged it off, but the smears definitely rattled him. He doesn't, being called a racist is kind of like that old accusation of being, when last did you beat your wife? It's just an accusation that sticks. But in our experience, in our interviews, in the research that we did, it seemed clear to us that he's really not a racist.
So, Chris, Jonathan mentioned the Freedom Charter. A lot of libertarians or right-minded people like to say it's a communist idea, especially the clause on property rights. Is it fair to say that the Freedom Charter was designed to create a communist state in South Africa?
Yeah, I haven't read it in a while, but I do remember that before the 1994 settlement, there was great unease about the clause about redividing the land. I think when you contemplate the Freedom Charter, you also have to bear in mind the context. And this is a document that was produced in 1955 or ratified in 1955 and was put together by people who were on the receiving end of terrible oppression. So, I think that is an important context to bear into mind. And if as Jonathan mentioned, that Pravin is a charterist, but I think if you asked him today, is every word of the Freedom Charter still, his political ideology? I think there would be areas where he would perhaps disagree, and he would say that that doesn't really fit with what's evolved in his political life. And so to try and answer the direct question about whether it's a communist manifesto, it's so difficult to be specific because you can interpret these things so broadly. I mean, the word libertarian which you used in a moment ago, has taken on different meanings to different people. And I think you could interpret this. You certainly could. You could make an argument that it's designed to create a communist state. And it has strong socialist leanings. But yeah, I mean, you could also make an argument that it's not.
So a document that was written about 50 or more years ago, a lot of people don't take it as seriously as people might think.
Yeah, I mean, people should take it seriously because it was kind of the founding document for the entire resistance and the ANC's existence. And it has very strong principles in there, the kind of non-racism and equality. Those elements of it are still very prevalent in the ideologies of the ANC and the governing party and people. But yeah, it is a product of its time, and I think if you got the same people to sit down now and to draw up the Freedom Charter again, it might emerge slightly differently.
That's interesting. So what I've found fascinating in the book, Chris, is the part where Pravin Gordhan joined the pre-democratic negotiations. And there was actually a moment, he was in the building when the RV Beer stormed the building. Can you tell us that story? That's such a fascinating tale.
Yeah, I was, coincidentally, I was also in the building as a journalist. So I have very, very vivid memories of it. Just going back to Pravin's role, he had joined the negotiations as a delegate from the Natal Indian Congress and had been recognized for his skills at chairing in subcommittees, and ultimately went on to chair the plenary sessions. And there were two famous plenary sessions that he chaired, the one which agreed on an election date and another which ratified the interim constitution. So he played a very significant role in those negotiations. But on the day in question, the right-wingers had gathered outside the centre and were protesting against the election. It was soon after the election date had been adopted. And next thing, they stormed through the gates, past the security. They had an armoured vehicle in the midst of them, which was being driven by the AWB's Hofstatter, the Iron Guard. They're all dressed in black, the sort of most militant elements of the AWB. And they smashed through the front, this massive plate glass window type thing in the front, and drove this vehicle into the foyer. And sort of everybody rushed in past them and then occupied the negotiating chamber. And it was a terribly frightening moment. I mean, I can remember watching from above, and suddenly the order and the sense of purpose of the entire building was just changed. It was just completely chaotic. And then what happened is the sort of senior negotiators and participants in the negotiations, they headed off deeper into the building, down these corridors, where the police security and their own bodyguards had been were stationed. And then they put themselves they sort of holed up in the offices back there. And Pravin was in an office with Mac and Rolf Meyer, and I think Joe Slovo was also in there, a good few of them. And Rolf Meyer tells an interesting anecdote. At one stage in this process, one of the bodyguards came into the room and said, "Listen, Eugene Terreblanche is next door." So Rolf goes out and pops his head in there and says, "Hi, Eugene," and Eugene says, "Hi," back. And he says, "So now what?" And Terreblanche says, "I don't know. They just got to this point and they and they didn't know what to do. But anyway, what eventually did happen was that police negotiated with the protesters and agreed to not take any punitive action against them on the day if they dispersed, and they eventually did. It was a very, very dramatic event, and the potential for some sort of violence was very high. But in the event, I remember, I think one of the delegates, Amit Chandra Rajbansi, was slapped by one of the AWB guys. And for the rest, they urinated on the carpets, they smashed up some of the furniture, and then they left. And it didn't really derail anything other than that day's proceedings.
So one can perhaps consider it a blessing that Eugene didn't know what to do. I mean, he had all that power, and yeah, it's great that he didn't know what to do. But Jonathan, after the election, Pravin Gordhan, with no real tax experience, became the commissioner of SARS. I mean, how did that happen?
Well, he didn't have tax experience. In fact, he's a pharmacist by training, and I suppose an activist by inclination. But what he did have was excellent organizational skills. And Trevor Manuel, who was then the Minister of Finance, wanted someone who had good political sensibilities and could streamline SARS. And Gordhan had a reputation as a sharp operator and a brilliant strategist on both political and economic matters. His organizational qualities were evident during the struggle days, and he was recognized as a master tactician during those negotiations. He had also excelled as a backbencher in Parliament and had played a crucial role in getting the first local government election off the ground. So it was all these skills that Manuel decided that he was the right person. But as you say, he had no tax experience, so he wasn't an obvious choice. But as Ishmael Momonia told us, he was working in the Treasury at the time, is that he might not have been an obvious choice, but he was an inspired one.
Yeah, just for interest's sake, how many people did you interview for this book? Which I would definitely recommend to anyone, because like I told you before the interview, I couldn't put it down. I had to read it like in 2 days. How many people did you interview for this book?
Oh, it's difficult to say offhand, but we interviewed a lot of people. We started interviewing people who were based with Pravin in Natal during the 70s. And there were fascinating stories and insights that came out of those interviews. And then we interviewed people who were with him in Operation Vula in the 80s. And then we interviewed people from SARS. So all along his career trajectory, we were interviewing people who played a role. I would imagine maybe 30, 40, 50, up to 50 people. Also people in cabinet. We interviewed a couple of cabinet ministers who were with him in cabinet. And then, of course, we interviewed him himself. And we had, I think he gave us about 8 hours of his time. And then we interviewed his wife and some other advisors, people who have been with him for many years. So it's difficult to say offhand, but I'd imagine about 40 people all in all.
Interesting, and it's so great to see this. Some journalists really doing their research. But Jonathan, can one say one of the reasons why SARS was so successful is because they made tax compliance to a large degree voluntarily? I mean, I can remember, and you mentioned in the book that he had a sit down with a lot of the bank managers or directors, and he tried to negotiate with them to try and pay tax, which I found very interesting, because I think that's a good way to go about doing this. Is that perhaps one of the reasons why SARS was so successful with him as the commissioner?
I think that in a sense, yes, because he was willing to negotiate and listen and make plans with the banks and companies and also individual taxpayers. And he was absolutely prepared to show that SARS would be reasonable. But I think that wasn't the only factor that led to SARS's success. He rebuilt that institution. He made it efficient and friendly, and he made it accessible. He introduced e-filing, which made it easier for people to comply. He also brought in excellent people who understood his strategy and could implement his strategy, people like Piet Richer and Johan van Lochenberg and Ivan Pillay. And Gordhan could see the big picture, but he could also get involved in the nitty-gritty details. I think, though, one of his biggest successes is that he went about changing people's mindset about paying tax for both SARS employees and for the public. He introduced this concept of the higher purpose, where basically paying tax was an act of patriotism. So what he was trying to do was to instill the idea that the country's success rested on having a level of compliance. He believed that if there was tax compliance, citizens would start to comply with the law, which would help move the country from the anarchy of apartheid to a law-based society. So tax was the foundation for building a developmental state, and without an efficient tax regime and without compliance, there wouldn't be satisfactory healthcare or decent schools or proper houses. And this sentiment was reflected in the Revenue Services advertising, which thanked taxpayers not for paying their tax, but for providing houses, clinics, and schools. So he built compliance by explaining to people where their tax money was going and how it actually benefited the country. So people could see and they could know that tax was going to build houses, clinics, and schools, and not going into politicians' pockets.
Yeah, that's obviously changed now. But Jonathan, if we can fast forward a bit to his tenure as the Minister of Finance, obviously his success as commissioner propelled him to that role. What was not so obvious in your book is what did President Zuma stand to gain from the nuclear deal with Russia? Perhaps you can give some context on that entire saga.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it was the nuclear deal that really showed Gordhan that there was something very, very wrong that was happening. If you remember, he had been, after SARS, he had been made finance minister. And Zuma brought him in. Zuma had just been elected president and brought him into the cabinet. And so he had started to see that there was, Gordhan had started to see that there had been some kind of corruption and things were happening. But it was the nuclear deal, when he realized that Zuma was trying to push it through, that he realized that this guy is up to no good. And in reality, it's a very short answer what Zuma stood to gain from it. Because at that point, it would appear that the Gupta brothers had him in their pocket or under their thumb or in a half Nelson. He was doing their bidding. The Guptas controlled the Shiva uranium mine and would have made an untold fortune if this nuclear deal, which was sort of valued at R1 trillion, had gone through. So it was the Guptas who had already had their hands on the levers of state-owned enterprises who were pushing these buttons, because what they wanted was to amass vast wealth for themselves, and they were doing it because Zuma was the person that was in the hot seat, and he was doing their bidding for them.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so it was mainly the Guptas that would have gained from that deal. Chris, a lot of people, if we can get back to the tenure of Pravin Gordhan as Minister of Finance, a lot of people like Davy Ruet, who has been on this show a few times, he likes to say that Pravin Gordhan is responsible for cadre deployment, for the massive increase in bureaucracy, the salaries that we now have a massive problem today. Is that fair to blame the minister for that? Or is he just a person following orders? How much blame can one attribute to Pravin Gordhan?
Yeah, neither of us are financial journalists. So we did interview a lot of people about this. And the one thing that did emerge from various people was that the state employee salary bill did rise quite significantly during his tenure. And so that certainly has colored his reputation. But all of these people that we talked to also said that judging a finance minister is a kind of, it takes time. Years later, you really see the impact and all that. So I think the jury is probably still out, although that fact that the salary bill jumped like that has colored perceptions of his time in that seat. But the other factor that South Africans don't really take into account about cabinet is that the decision-making process that takes place in South Africa particularly, and it's also significant in the context now in his current job, in that he, as he put it, I can't just take a decision and then go and do it. You have to get it, it has to go through the ANC, NEC, it has to go through the cabinet, and you're talking about a party which is quite split at the moment. So making decisions and getting decisions through is a difficult thing, and they almost always are collective decisions. Some of the criticism that's directed at individuals like him, for example, about SAA is quite often, I think, unfair.
How much responsibility do you think a Minister of Finance has to make his own choices in light of the ANC's power? Like, how much can one actually attribute to a Minister of Finance and not to the ANC?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer, because a good finance minister, I would say, would persuade his colleagues, would be able to say, hey, guys, listen, we've got to be fiscally responsible. We can't push up the salary bill. We've got to keep our debt in a good space. But that requires a certain amount of persuasion. And quite often, I'd imagine in a forum like the ANC's NEC, you would have people pushing back and saying, we've got to spend money on, rehabilitation of townships and the like. So yeah, he does. A finance minister does have to, take the rap about poor performance. But most certainly, it's a very, very difficult space to be in, and I think they have to be very tough.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point you make. I mean, the Minister of Finance, he can make the arguments. Most of the decisions can come from the ANC, but he can make the argument that should be changed. But during his second tenure as the Minister of Finance, the stories came to light in the media from the Sunday Times, from Hofstatter, from KPMG, that there was a rogue unit in SARS that he was responsible for, and that the argument was made to remove him as Minister of Finance. Can you tell us what is the context of that? What happened?
Well, we talked to a lot of the people involved in that saga, a lot of the people from SARS who subsequently got fired by Tom Moyane, and others who had insights. And their belief, some of it based on evidence, some of it speculative, is that the State Security Agency was doing Jacob Zuma's bidding at the time. Pravin Gordhan became an obstacle to his state capture objectives, and so they resurrected or invented this state capture, this rogue unit allegation. And they found a very handy vehicle in the Sunday Times investigative unit, which appears not to have bothered to verify this sort of documentation, that they ran with stories that they didn't get, they weren't actually able to substantiate. And these stories were just coming week after week after week and becoming increasingly bizarre. I mean, they alleged that the so-called rogue unit was running a brothel with no evidence. And to this day, no one's ever been able to say, where was it located, who was it staffed by, and the like. So that's where it came from. It was designed to discredit Gordhan and give Moyane the power to get rid of the likes of Ivan Pillay and Johan van Lochrenberg and other people who were doing a very good job in SARS at the time.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but a person like Hofstatter, he was at a book launch, and one of the people that was actually fired in this process confronted him. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, I've just forgotten his name. Jono, do you remember?
Pete Richer.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So Stefan Hofstatter launched a book ironically, about state capture at a place called Love Books in Johannesburg. And there were people there who were protesting against the coverage that the Sunday Times had done. And he seemed to be quite dismissive of it. But then Peter Richer stood up, and Peter Richer was one of the people who'd been badly damaged and effectively lost his job because of the Sunday Times' coverage. And he stood up and detailed how the Sunday Times had got it so terribly wrong. And I think, to Hofstatter's credit, he subsequently apologized and kind of distanced himself from that. But the other guys in that unit, I mean, are still trying to sell the Rogue Unit story, in spite of the fact that it's been sort of discredited very, very thoroughly.
Yeah, there's footage of that incident on, at Love Books on. I'm sure you can find it on YouTube if you Google it, and it's very, very powerful. Watching Pete Richer get up and pointing his finger at Hofstatter and saying, this is what you have done. This is how you've destroyed people's lives, and it kind of summed up the devastation that these journalists, or kind of so-called journalists, really did.
That's interesting. I'm definitely going to check that out. I didn't know that. I'm just definitely going to check that out after that on YouTube. Jonathan, so Pravin Gordhan, he was confronted with this apparent damning evidence, and he went to President Zuma, and can you tell us that story of how he confronted President Zuma? Where does this come from? Why are you targeting me?
Yeah. So, I mean, it has in its history, where the Guptas had tried to have Des van Rooyen appointed as the finance minister after that whole Nkandla Nene incident where Nene was unceremoniously fired. And that's when the bottom fell out of the country. And then in order for sort of Zuma to, there was a lot of pressure then put on Zuma to bring Gordhan back. So Gordhan then replaced Van Rooyen. And so it was a few months later, and that's when it was full-out war between Zuma and Gordhan. Even though he had appointed him as Minister of Finance to replace Van Rooyen, these two men were at war. And so it was just, I think it was in February. So this would have happened, I think, in December. And then a few months later, or November, December, a few months later, Gordhan was putting the final touches to his budget speech when an envelope was hand-delivered to the Treasury. And he opened it up, and there were these 27 questions from the Hawk relating to this kind of so-called rogue unit. And the Hawks gave Gordhan 2 weeks to answer these questions. And it was maybe just coincidence that these questions had arrived soon after the Gupta's looting project was at risk. So Gordhan then went directly to Zuma, and he took these 27 questions with him, and he said, and he gave it to Zuma, and he said, "What's going on?" And he said to him, Gordhan had survived the security police in the apartheid era, and now Zuma was wanting to have him killed under democracy. And Gordhan told us that Zuma flipped through the pages without reading the questions, but just flipping through the pages and saying he was going to check it out. He was going to check it out. So he couldn't answer him directly. He couldn't confront Gordhan because Zuma doesn't like to confront people directly. He does it at the stroke of midnight. When people are asleep, he makes an announcement.
So do you think he knew that President Zuma was behind this? Is that why he confronted him?
Yes, I think he knew. I mean, he had been under attack from that moment. In fact, he after his first stint as finance minister, when he was sort of demoted to Cogta, he knew that he had run foul of Zuma. But when he was reappointed as finance minister, I think the phrase that he used was that the gloves had come off, and he knew then that this was a collision course waiting to happen. And it was quite clear that the ministers in the cabinet who were supporting Zuma were targeting him. It was a very rough year. He only had that position for a year before he was then eventually fired. Quite dramatically, he was recalled from an investor roadshow to where he was in the UK. But it was a hell of a year where he was just batting away charges and kind of missiles that were being launched at him. We kind of forget about that year, but it was a very, very, we were on a slippery slope and we were sort of tumbling down.
Yeah, no, I can just imagine the pain of being a Minister of Finance in that period. But Chris, what's very interesting to me is in the book you mention and you talk about the Indian Cabal. And I've never heard this theory, and I think a lot of people have never heard really this theory, which is now predominantly being pushed by the EFF. And as apparently Pravin Gordhan is part of this Indian Cabal that goes all the way back to apartheid. What is the story and the origins of this Indian Cabal?
Yeah, you're right. It was recently resurrected by Floyd Shivambu of the EFF, but he was using it, I think, as a populist ploy to manipulate tensions between African and Indian South Africans. It wasn't a terribly sophisticated process that he went through, and he based his comments on quite a strange document that is in an archive on South African history, and it's an incomplete document and no one knows who authored it. So there's a little bit of a mystery about it, but we did interrogate the whole issue quite thoroughly, and it did emerge that there had been allegations of an Indian cabal in the struggle years in the 70s. And in essence, people felt that Gordhan and some others aligned to him had accumulated too much power around themselves and were kind of running the show more than they should. But yeah, we talked to a lot of people about it, and generally the view of most of the people from those days was that sorry. Oh, excuse me. Sorry about that. Generally, the view of the activists from those days was that Gordhan was quite blunt in the way he worked in those days, and it got some people's backs up. And generally, there was a feeling that he was also very successful, and there was a lot of jealousy directed at him.
So one can say it's almost like what the theory behind white monopoly capital. It's purely just a conspiracy theory. There's almost no basis in fact.
Yeah, that's the view that most people seem to have. People who were activists at the time, whether they be African, Indian, white, or whatever. It also seemed to be designed to divide people along racial lines, which is what Shivambu is once again trying to do. But yeah, I don't think there's great substance to it. I mean, there was certainly some fairly petty jealousies going around at the time. We did ask him, we asked him directly, was there a cabal? And he said, well, and he pointed to Jonathan and I and said, imagine you two are running a football team and both of you want to be the chairman. And Chris has his supporters, Jonathan has his supporters. That's two cabals. So, yeah, he was fairly dismissive of it as well.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point to make. But gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Yeah, like I said, I definitely recommend anyone to go out and buy this book. It's such an interesting read. I want to give you one last opportunity to add, plug, or say anything that you want to, Jonathan.
I just wanted to say that the book is an unauthorized biography in the sense that although Gordhan collaborated with us, it's independent, and we came up with our own conclusions about who he is and what he's about. So he had no control over the content, or he had no oversight over the content. He agreed to be interviewed, but he had absolutely no, sort of say over what we were going to write or what we weren't going to write.
Chris?
Yeah, we set out in this book to really interrogate who is this man, because he's a bit of an enigma. And the one question we asked, is he a clean politician? And we genuinely expected to find some dirt, and we didn't. So I think we might have found that rare beast.
Yeah, I mean, not to find dirt on a South African politician should be a clear signal that this guy should be clean. But gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. This has been such an interesting conversation. To our viewers, if you've made it this far, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and donating on Patreon. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.